sorry?
Are you gonna use this?
Yes.
So if you wanna sit on the end here.
Okay.
Then you can see. Right.
Okay, that makes the most sense.
So then you can see this one.
Good. I'm gonna play with it, just make sure it works. They want me to face this way.
Is this okay? Hello.
It'll be all right. I just want to make sure I can work.
I'm just like taking notes.
I'll make sure I can use the microphone. Honestly, I'd be okay if I said that. I'm gonna smash my knees here. You keep smashing my knees here.
So we've got a council member videotaping upstairs, so
Any tricks to these?
Deputy Mayor not with us today?
Will I be on the whole time? Get to push?
I saw a text or email from him today.
We're on now? No, you're right.
We have a council member completing a task upstairs, so we've been waiting a couple of minutes, but here he is. I'd like to call this study session of Lakewood City Council for Monday, March 9th to order. First item of this first is the item is Pierce Transit's presentation on Destination 2040 Long-Range Plan. We have Mr. Darren Stavish, Principal Planner from Pierce Transit.
Thank you, Mayor Anderson and fellow council members. I appreciate your interest in our long-range plan update, and thank you for having us. This is an interim update. As you may or may not remember, we adopted our initial inaugural Destination 2040 long-range plan in April of 2016. And about a year ago, we heard from our executive team and our board to kind of relook at it, see what's changed, because a lot has changed in the last 4 years. It is what one of my coworkers named a fiscally constrained vision, and what we mean by that is that we actually put some dollar figures to what we could do if we were to expand the service. If you recall, or you might not recall, The last plan was fiscally unconstrained, and we just showed straight line growth at 2.5, and 3% based on what the Puget Sound Regional Council's Transportation 2040 prescribed at the time. So with this, we took another look, and we took the 2%, and we'll talk about it in a minute as I get a little bit deeper into what the content. Again, we're asked, why do an update? And there have been so many changes in the last 4 years to the point that we felt that we needed to revisit some of the changes. On the transportation side, of course, our Pacific Avenue State Route 7 bus rapid transit began. It's be our first corridor and what we hope are many. The study began in February 2017 in earnest, and as we speak, we are already almost at 30% design. So that project is moving right along. Sound Transit 3 passed, of course, November 2016, and there's been ongoing development and coordination with both agencies as they start to bring light rail down to Tacoma Dome Station. Autonomous vehicles have been tested internationally, or I think will be a reality much sooner than we know. And first mile, last mile, or microtransit pilot projects, of which we launched one that ended at the end of last year, and we will be looking at that again very shortly in the Ruston Way corridor. On the land use side, of course, I'm thrilled and excited to have come to your Lakewood Station Sub-Area Plan kickoff meeting last week. We know this has been in your plan for the long time, and I think the time is right, and I think this area is absolutely perfect for it. There's already good transit here. There's a demand, but I think bringing greater densities and more demand for even more frequent, reliable transit, including a hard look at BRT, are certainly in order, and we're really pleased to see that. I'll have you take a look at our expansion vision on BRT in Section 7 if you get a chance, because we will be studying further which of the two routes would make the most sense, whether it's the current 2 or the current 3, but both would terminate here. So either way, I think it's a win-win for the city of Lakewood and certainly for our agency. And finally, on the planning side, Vision 2050 that is in progress at the Puget Sound Regional Council shows a lot more growth in Pierce County than predicted just a few short years ago. Before it was the people are coming, now it's they're here, and we really need to plan for it with much better transit and more multimodal land uses. Oops, going wrong way. People ask what's in the plan, and I'll just give you a brief overview here. We did try to, again, because it is an update, we tried to follow the template of the last plan and kind of revisit things that were in the last plan, update them. So it is a document that we hope complements it, that doesn't supplant it or replace it. And these are the different chapters, different sections that you'll see when you take a look at the plan. One of the things, again, that we wanted to emphasize was the growth, particularly as prescribed by the Puget Sound Regional Council in their Vision 2050 plan. We also have some new routes, greater frequencies. So 10 new routes are shown, greater frequencies on 17 routes. And what we mean by that, to steal a tagline from our friends at King County Metro up north, is almost show up and go service. There will be no route during the day where you'll wait any longer than a half hour. Most routes are 15 to 20 minutes. And we're excited by that. So we're really saturating the network. Again, keeping pace with change we talked about, which is the projections, population and employment growth. We then had the entire new route network modeled by the Puget Sound Regional Council using their 4-step model. And we went from 28,000 boardings per day, average boardings per day, to over 85,000. So the network really works in the 4-step model, and it was run twice to test. And this is based on a full Sound Transit 3 build-out, as well as all of our routes being in place at the same time. And that you really get the synergy or the exponential bump when you have transit that's frequent, reliable, and connected. And that's been shown over and over again in these modeling results. What the routes look like in a map, again, anything that's blue is going to be 15 to 30 minutes, and anything that's red is going to be under 15 minutes, and the dashed lines are bus rapid transit. We need to emphasize, too, with bus rapid transit that the agency is going to engage in a study beginning probably this fall to look at the entire network and see what makes the most sense. In my mind, I think South Tacoma Way would be easier to build because there's a lot more room. And of course, you know that Bridgeport is finished, and talking to your friends and our partners in University Place, they don't particularly like the idea of us tearing it up. So I think that If we were to do something on the current Route 2, it would probably be a little bit faster along 19th and then probably more of a skip stop or limited stop express type of service down Bridgeport Way, terminating here. And again, in my mind, I think South Tacoma Way probably has a little bit more room for a full-blown BRT, but it's also a lot more expensive. We think both will work, and we think both will be in our short-term plans. We started using a tool called Social Pinpoint. To put it in perspective, in the last long-range plan, we just took static comments, and we got about 30. In this one, we've received almost 300 to date of static comments, but we're also using a Social Pinpoint tool, which people can go in and actually pin a comment, or they can draw a route, they can tell us what they like, what they don't like, and then similar to a Facebook type of platform, they can do thumbs up or thumbs down. I agree with that, I don't agree with that. So you can tag on to other people's comments. And for the most part, they've been pretty positive, but we hear the same thing over and over again, just as we heard at the end of 2016 when we did our comprehensive fixed route analysis that was launched in the spring of 2017. More frequency, more reliability, more nights, more weekends. I'd use your system if it could get me where I needed to go when I needed to go. And as we all know, if it's not travel time competitive with a car, people will choose to drive. And that's not what we want. That's not great transit. Great transit is, it's always there. And if you miss the bus, you're not going to run across South Tacoma Way, take your life in your hands, because I can't wait an hour for the next bus or a half hour. And that's the kind of system we envision, and that's what we want to show people and hopefully produce soon. As far as the pies go, I apologize that these aren't colored, but or color-coded, but what they are is the types of comments that we receive through people in the Social Pinpoint platform. And again, we've had almost 6,000 visits with 2,200 people participating. Ideas and suggestions was the most popular. Number 2 was something I like. Number 3 was different schedules. Number 4 was more direct access. Number 5 was draw or extend a route, and that's where they can actually use a mapping tool. And then the last was something I like. So we know we've got a long way to go. I mean, we realize the system we're offering isn't the best, but we think with more service hours, we could really build something that people would be proud of and would utilize, as I mentioned before, based on the modeling results. With that, and I talk fast, we're in our public review and comment period that will end on Friday, April 10th. I'd like to take this plan to our board asking for official adoption on Monday, April 13th. We did get a letter from the city of Lakewood in January, particularly talking about bus rapid transit and the need and the desire for it, and seriously looking at both Route 2s and 3s, and we appreciated that. I'd like to make this part of the record. But if council would like to read the plan and comment, even just on one section, whether it's on the BRT again, we'd very much welcome a letter of support, what we could do better, what you'd like to see next time. Not to dismiss or kind of discount this work, we will have to do it again as part of the Vision 2050 update. So there'll be a major brand new transportation, or in our case, Destination 2050 plan that'll start in earnest in about 2 years when the Vision 2050 plan is adopted. So remember, we always follow the PSRC, we're always behind them, and all transit agencies will have to do a full-blown brand new plan at that time. With that, any questions or comments or anything that we can?
Mr. Whalen.
Well, thank you very much for coming.
pleasure.
It's always a pleasure to get an update. The question that I have is, how much does the plan incorporate the anticipated revenue increase with the vote yet to come?
We didn't talk about that specifically because we can't, but what we did do, when I say fiscally constrained vision, is we said with this amount of dollars, we could build 735,000 service hours. And to put it in perspective, we're at 500,000 flat budgeted right now. So it's 47% more hours. And again, it really saturates the service. It also creates, like I mentioned, mobility on demand and some of the other things that we're not doing right now that we can't afford.
So the 736 is based on existing revenues, not in contemplation of the additional?
No, it's based on contemplation of future sales tax revenues, of going to the full 9/10 of 1% that we're allowed by the PTVA. Right now, we're at 6/10, and we've been holding at 6/10. To put it in by comparison, our friends in Thurston County went from 6/10 to 1.2, and I think it was, I don't even believe it was gradual. I think it was all at once. And I'm thinking, if they can do it in Thurston County, why can't we? Why can't we get the full 9? Because we can do so much more with so little more funding. So yes, to answer your question, it is constrained, but constrained by funding that we don't have. And we do show the dollar amounts, what we would spend if we were able to start that sales tax revenue as soon as 2021.
Okay, thank you.
So, Mr. Bolke.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I want you to go back to your comments on the BRT, because we've only discussed the BRT really as, it's my understanding, I may be wrong, within the city is a BRT, South Tacoma Way, Pack Highway kind of BRT. Now you're mentioning Bridgeport.
Correct.
So I'm trying to envision the route, and then why Bridgeport? Is it ridership is dictating that?
Ridership actually, coincidentally, the 1 is our most ridden, the 2 is our second most ridden, and the 3 is the third most ridden. So the 2, actually, the Bridgeport Way, 19th to Bridgeport to down here is our second most. So we're kind of wrestling back and forth with which one makes the most sense for us to do. We could, I don't want to say do it on the cheap, but we could do Route 2 as more as a BRT light type of model, more of a skip stop, express enhanced bus, versus the 3 that we would do full-blown BRT like we're doing on the 1. So I think there's pros and cons to both, and I think that we really need to do a deeper dive and have an independent study done for somebody to show us outside the agency, you know, somebody that's a lot more objective versus subjective.
And what's your timing on that?
We'd like to get that started as soon as this fall.
Okay.
Because, as you know, BRT is expensive and you only have one shot to do it right. And we want to make sure that the next quarter we build makes the most sense based on ridership projections and land use patterns. And there's just no room or no money to do it wrong or do the wrong one next. Okay. I think you're in a very fortunate position here because, again, both the next 2 make perfect sense, would terminate here or would serve this area and beyond, right where we're sitting. So that's why, again, I was so thrilled and excited to come to that kickoff meeting last week. The same thing that the Tacoma Mall group did with their sub-area plan EIS. It's a great opportunity for you all, and I think nothing but good things are going to come out of it.
So, as Mr. Berenstain.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I had a question about in your envisioned potential expansion of services to do that. In the last time, there was a significant adjustment. Some of the services to JBLM were curtailed. And I didn't hear you mention like restoring them or looking at that as we're looking through the Pierce County Regional Council and the Puget Sound Regional Council of trying to get JBLM recognized as a regional center and the employment nexus that it is. And also while we do have the route that goes to Madigan, which is a major healthcare destination for many folks. But I kind of wondering what is sort of envisioned. Should you be going to an expansion of looking like restoring service onto McCord Field that was eliminated in the last change?
Yeah, I'm not in service planning, so I'm going to have to punt that one and probably get back to you. I know ridership was not great on that route. But the nice thing is with rubber-tired buses, it's a lot easier to restore if there is a ridership. But that's not really answering your question. I'm not sure. I'd have to look at the decision was made why that route was eliminated in the last go-around. And not knowing these by heart, I can look and see what if any of the routes that are on our plan do directly serve JBLM. I can check that before I leave.
Okay, and then the Puget Sound Clean Air Agency has just finished a comment period on what's their strategy going to be to try to reduce transportation fuel emissions. And I know that Pierce Transit has, when I look out there, I see electric buses, I see hybrid buses, I see natural gas buses, I see some vehicles that are still fossil fuel buses. I guess is there any projection or milestones that Pierce Transit has set that are either to convert certain numbers of buses or that milestones expressed in terms of the agency's carbon footprint?
Yes, and that is clearly stated in the appendices. Our agency sustainability and climate action plan is one of them. Alex, correct me if I'm wrong, but It's been 20% of our vehicles to be battery electric by, I mean, originally we said 2020, but we are looking at, they're known as BEBs now. We do have 3 in our fleet, and we're looking to buy more beginning next year. We hesitated at first because they didn't perform as well as planned, but I think it's safe to say that following the statewide mandate that we would be mostly electric or all electric by the end of the decade.
I think the original goal set by the board was 30% electric, but we didn't have a timeline. But
Yeah.
now the vision is to have the entire BRT network electric.
Yes,
So that will.
that's a good point. Our friends in, we've been following other peer agencies as they build bus rapid transit in Indianapolis, Indiana. The Indigo system is, or their battery electric 60-foot coaches, and they're performing quite well. So we think that it would make perfect sense for us, for right out of the box, for our BRT lines to be battery electric, BEBs.
And so is that built into your projections of what you could do if you move the sales tax percentage? Is that dependent upon that, I guess?
No, it's in our plan now. No, that is actually constrained. That actually is in our budget, because on our replacement cycle, we don't necessarily have to automatically buy CNG because they're cheaper. We have in our budget now, and I can get you those figures, because the buy for the next 5 years, there are battery electric buses in the buy already, regular 40-foot coaches. So it wouldn't be just for the BRT. So.
And I frequently see notices where you're looking for people to come drive.
Oh, heavens.
And I guess, you know, is there a challenge finding people who can meet all the qualifications that go with what you've got to do to be able to drive and public
Very much
transportation?
so. It's a national, it's almost a crisis now. Our management goes to the APTA conference every year. It's the American Public Transportation Association. Everything from journeymen, mechanics, planners, CEOs. There just isn't an interest in transit like there was in our generation, in our day, and I don't understand why, because it's a great way to make a living. But yes, for operators, we're begging for operators. I think I heard King County Metro has 400 vacancies at any given time. I was in Denver over New Year's Eve, and they're actually canceling trains. They're saying this train, no operator, this train's not coming. So you're watching that says next train in 7 minutes, 6 minutes says no train, no operator, and then it starts over again. I kid you not, to 10 minutes, because they can't find enough people to drive the light rail there. They're begging for people. Everywhere you look at RTD Denver, it says, do you know anybody that wants to drive for us or be a light rail operator? So yes, it's a national problem.
And it's exacerbated by the fact that there's great longevity at Pierce Transit, and so we have an aging workforce.
Yes.
Well, I guess, are there some strategies that cities, school district, and local workforce partners could do with you to help with that in the long term? I know I was looking at the menu that the Clover Park School District had for Clover Park High School about employers who were coming to present, and I didn't see Pierce Transit on there.
We definitely want to be there next time.
Or is there an age limit where a graduating high school student wouldn't be?
I think that, and I have to get smart, I don't know where it is right now, I can follow up, but the maintenance shop is trying to establish an apprenticeship program. I think the partner is Clover Park. Yeah, which would be incredible, because, you know, we would pay for their school, they would come over, it's up the street. Yeah, it's a beautiful thing, so I actually.
Yeah, we can find out about that for you. 'Cause
Well,
it's a great suggestion if we're
I
not doing it
guess
already.
coming back to me is less important than maybe reaching out to the school district. If there is if you want to establish an information channel and an access to do that. There's
Yeah, we can show you some figures about our aging workforce. The number of people that are retiring in the next 5 years, it's really staggering.
One of the other challenges with becoming an operator is the training is pretty intense, and then the hours, you're kind of on call, so it's a very volatile
Yeah.
first couple months.
the new person doesn't get the best schedule.
Yeah, they have something actually called a shakeout, and under the collective bargaining agreement, people come in as what you call temporary, they don't call it temporaries, what is it, relief drivers. And so they get to take, they're working pretty much full-time, but they don't know what route they're gonna be driving. They're trained on a few, and then they call them in when they need them, and they fill holes. And then you gain tenure, and you get to bid on routes, like airplane pilots bid on routes based on tenure.
Not that different than the Navy that just tells people, join the Navy, you see the world, here you can see Pierce County.
So I had yeah. So I had a couple of comments. One, I will continue to advocate as a representative from Lakewood on Pierce Transit Board for further extension of it. When we do BRT2, when we get that far, it's actually going to be a board decision as to what the exact route is. It has to be approved. And I believe it should go to Springbrook, Woodbrook, Tillicum, and JBLM. And the reason for that is that Springbrook, Woodbrook, and Tillicum are demographically challenged, underserved areas, and they provide lifeline service. The other really, I would say, good justification for transit is employment. And Main Gate's going to be reconfigured, and you could do the skip stops down the freeway. You don't have to fully build out BRT just to extend it down there. So I think that's a good idea, and Woodbrook's going to be an employment center too. So that I will continue to advocate on there. The comment with respect to the financing that's coming up is a very difficult question. The board hasn't considered it fully at this point. Will fairly shortly. Well, Kitsap, and I think Thurston, and I think Kitsap both have 1.2%, and community. We actually have a 2.0 transit sales tax now because the pig at the trough, Sound Transit, has 1.4 and we get 0.6. And if you look at what's going on in Pierce County, you get a lot more for your 0.6 than you get for your 1.4. I think that's, and Sound Transit intends to phase out a good deal of the express bus service. So there are two things that, somebody's trying to sell me something, sorry. There are two things that I'm going to try to potentially advocate on, both involving some of those existing funds. Puget Sound Regional Council every year has a carve out for transit of, it's been about $25 million. For some reason that just confounds me, about 10 million of that every year goes to Sound Transit, and the other 15, 16 million goes to the four transit agencies within the district: Kitsap, Community, us, and Metro. $10 million is budget dust in Sound Transit's world. Why they come in and scrape money away from the local transit agencies is, to me, it's unconscionable. So at Puget Sound Regional Council, both on Transportation Policy Board and now as Lakewood's, as Pierce Transit's representative, I'm going to ask the board to endorse the position that all that money should go to local transit agencies. That's only about, your share of it's only maybe $5 million a year if you're lucky. And I'm going to advocate the same as Lakewood's representative on the Puget Sound Regional Council. In addition to that, I'm discussing with some other representatives the possibility of probably a fruitless, but maybe symbolic, but maybe fruitless effort to redefine sub-area equity in the Sound Transit world, which would potentially be done by legislative action without, and saying that it doesn't mean Pierce County is subsidizing transportation to service employers in King County. The whole idea of MPO, Puget Sound Regional Council, is to plan so that you have people who work and live in the same area. So you don't need $100 million a mile light rail when you can have $10 million a mile bus rapid transit and get the same impact, 1/10 the cost. So the idea is to try to find a way to advocate a carve-out from the Sound Transit evergreen, then that money's always going to be collected. You know, in theory, it has someday it'll end, but they keep extending projects. Most of their sub-area equity up there is going from West Seattle to downtown. They get all of the inside King County transportation. We get to subsidize people going to work up there while they get the taxes. So I think that money should be used more for circulation in Pierce County as part of a regional transportation system. Well, there's a tie. So that's another potential funding source. We can't, you know, it doesn't appear we can get our car tab money back. Sound Transit bonded it all. So we probably can't get that back from a legal standpoint. They now got a hand in the till for property tax. They get some off the recording fee in addition to 1.4%. So if we can find a way to. What rental car money, that's what it is. Rental car money, not recording fee, it's the rental car money. And the rental car thing is going up. It's like doubling. So maybe we can find a way to fund something like this that people at Pierce County can actually use. So that's my diatribe on the thing. I think we need my belief is we need a more robust local transit system. The problem is we're already paying 2.0% on our sales tax for it, for a transit system, and we're not getting our money's worth. It's not Pierce Transit's fault. This is the most efficient delivery that there is. Have some? Well, actually, I think it's a setup for having our own MPO someday, but we need a different governor because this governor would never allow us to have our own MPO. It's just a fact. I mean, it's.
Well, thank you again for your interest and your questions. and
Thanks.
We'll definitely get back to you on
Thank
the
you.
things that we couldn't answer here. It was our pleasure. We appreciate your support.
Good to see you again. Take care.
Now we move to Pierce County Legislative Policy Manual Update with Ms. Kelly Fong.
I don't know if that's any better. Well, good evening, Mayor, Deputy Mayor, and council members. At the March 2nd, 2020 council meeting, there was an interest expressed in a potential amendment to the City of Lakewood's County Legislative Policy Manual to include language encouraging Pierce County to adopt a county-level sales and use tax for chemical dependency or mental health treatment services or therapeutic courts. The attached draft, which is found on page 14 of your packet, includes proposed language under the public safety section of the manual. The City Council may approve the proposed amendment to the manual at the March 16th, 2020 meeting. Alternatively, the City Council could choose to alter the proposed language prior to its adoption or elect to not adopt the language at all. This concludes my presentation. Does the City Council have any comments or questions?
Questions from council, Mr. Branstetter.
I have no questions. You know, I'm certainly glad we brought forward the idea of inserting this into our thing to do that. However, I do have some thoughts about adjusting the wording somewhat. That I think that if I would take the last sentence out of the draft and substitute something that says the city encourages Pierce County to implement and resource such a strategy and tools. And I would think that our manual should not be about a tax, but it should be about a solution, and that we feel that the place the solution has to be driven from legislatively is at Pierce County. And so, and then I would change the heading to merely say mental health and chemical dependency as the area there. I think the county council could, by saying that we're looking for them to, you know, to implement resource tools, many of them will connect the dots to passing the tax. But, you know, our concern isn't that they pass the tax. Our concern is that they implement the tools, and that the tools that they do implement, they got the resources to do something with. So I'd like to see the focus sort of change as to what it is our real interest. Because a tax with no plan and no tools, you know, isn't what I think we want to be advocating for. But I think we want the county to know that if they get a ball rolling, we'll help them push it.
I think now the term everybody uses is behavioral health rather than mental health. So that's actually, so I would ask that we call it behavioral health and chemical dependency. I agree with Councilmember Brandstetter. I think that the council should be left to come up with its own plan rather than us saying, well, it wasn't good enough for us, but you guys go ahead and do it. I mean, it kind of is a little bit, you know, not a profile in courage, shall we say. So I would agree with some different wording on the last sentence, but if you could change that to behavioral health, that would be great.
Mr. Whalen?
Yes, the heading should be changed to behavioral health and chemical dependency for sure. I would agree we should tweak the last sentence. I'm not sure that it's an abandonment of the smart approach to a regional look at the tools, but I think we do need to, in this policy manual, kind of back away from the encouragement of a specific adoption of a tax. We could say perhaps the city would support a regional funding approach for chemical dependency and behavioral health treatment services, consistent with identifiable needs or something to that effect, which would implicate that there had been some actual intent to collate the data and come up with a funding plan at the regional level. That's my thought. I mean, there's a lot of wordiness there, but I think you get the picture.
Anyone else? Ms. Farmer?
So I know we don't actually have a different header, but I wanted to bring this up for discussion. Are we comfortable with it under the header for public safety? To me, that seems a little, not quite the best fit.
All these things are under public safety, but they should be.
It should really.
Yeah, might be best to be on its own, is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, it doesn't fit under the heading.
I'm cool with that.
Dan?
I apologize, I couldn't hear Councilmember Boki's comment.
I'm fine with that, yeah. It should probably be its own heading since it's so broad now. Once you do behavioral health, chemical dependency, and you're getting into all this other stuff, you need to, I think that would be a good way to go. I think that's a good suggestion. I'm okay with it. But I'm not everybody here, so.
Yeah, I think it's getting pretty tangential as far as it's linked to the heading goes, so that'd be a good idea, I think.
Do you have enough clarity? Do you feel comfortable?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. We now move to the review of the 2020 SSMCP work plan.
Good evening, Bill Adamson with you once again. As I start this, let me remind you, for those of you that weren't around back in 2010 when the growth coordination plan was accomplished or finished, there were 6 recommendations that came out of that. Growth Coordination Plan, which became the core objectives of SSMCP, you can see on this slide. First one there, promote JBLM as a center of regional economic significance. We really kicked off, made great strides with that back in 2018 when we did our JBLM regional economic impact of the workforce, the JBLM workforce. And that's where we came up with a $9.2 billion tag to the impact of JBLM to the South Sound, defined as Pearson, Thurston County, and the Nisqually tribal area. We continue that work this year with an update to that. We've also just concluded a local business survey, so that work is ongoing. Number two, formalize a method of regional collaboration is really the creation of SSMCP and the way we've run our organization with elected officials, councils, an executive leadership team, a steering committee, and a number of working groups. Under number three, improve support for military families. That falls primarily into three of our working groups, the social services, healthcare, and education working groups. Improve access to existing services. Once again, it's the work of our working groups and steering committee that is the way that we get through that. Improve access to information. We share regionally at our steering committees between leaders of cities and counties. The mayor in his Pierce County hat, the city manager in his city hat attend regularly. These are monthly meetings that we held. That really improves information flow because the JBLM chief of staff is the rep from JBLM, and he's been consistent for over a decade, so that's really helpful as well. And lastly, on regional mobility, we only have to look down the road there. SSMCP as well as Lakewood lobbied really hard for the congestion relief project, and SSMCP continues that work for the Thurston County area primarily. South Pierce, right there at Mounts Road where the train derailed south across the Nisqually River Bridge is the dividing line between the counties. So that 1.7 mile stretch is actually in Pierce, and then the remainder of it is through Thurston County down to exit 99. And we've been successful obtaining funds for that. Our biennial SSMCP work plans are approved and adopted each year by our elected officials council. We'll present that in November at the elected officials council in November 2020, and we'll be looking at the 21-22 biennium at that time. So we have 8 work plan priorities for 2019 and 2020. I'll just quickly review where we're at with these. On task 1, this has to do with OEA grants and the work on strategies that we've done in the past. We've actually completed the 3 that you see listed here under task 1. The military influence area assessment and overlay, the regional lighting study, and the JBLM land exchange plan were all completed this past summer. And we've started work on 3 new tasks. One has to do with the conservation efforts for the 3 endangered species, the streaked-horned lark, the Mazama pocket gopher, and the Taylor checker spot butterfly. The streaked-horned lark resides on McCord Field, so that's a Pierce County problem. And actually, Roy has its own version of the Mazama pocket gopher that we're working to help relocate. And this is all to mitigate the impacts to JBLM's training and operations. We're also working a local road network. You know, we've done a lot of work on I-5, but we haven't really taken a good look at the arterial roads that lead into I-5 and into the access points to the base. So we're undergoing that right now. And then lastly, we have a grant to look at affordable housing for enlisted service members and families, especially junior enlisted with families. They're having a hard time keeping up with the pace of real estate appreciation around here. And so this, that task force that we form is looking at that. On task 2, implement a program to secure funding to resolve McCord Airfield clear zone encroachment. This remains a work in progress, but as you may have heard on Q13 and other venues, We have executed a cooperative agreement between the City of Lakewood and the U.S. Army, which acknowledges an $80 million funding requirement. This cooperative agreement establishes a mechanism to obtain federal funding for the North Clear Zone. And we're working on our initial big purchase right now, the Tactical Tailor Facility. It's not to say that there aren't issues, and we're going to brief the city manager tomorrow on some of those issues. But this is the first time this has been done this way. And I'm talking about across the nation, this is the first time this has been done. So we have to really work through some challenges. Number 3, task 3, we have collaborated with others in the region, and we were awarded $2.25 million from the state legislature in 2019 for completing the study we started the prior year. This is the Tumwater Mounts Road stretch that I talked about earlier. And we continue this work into 2020, and we will have a legislative ask in the long session next year for more money, the additional $2.25 million that we need. Task 4, SSMCP continues to grow and evolve. SSMCP sets the standard nationally for community organizations that support military-affiliated communities. The organization garners recognition at all levels from military and civilian leaders alike. A notable example includes the frequent participation with the Association of Defense Communities conferences, where we serve as a resource, as speakers on panels, and highlighting our efforts with the McCord North Clear Zone and off-base housing. Recently, we added the Thurston County Chamber as our co-chair to the working group that we have for business and econ development. We added Bates Technical College as a working group chair for the education working group, and we added Vineyard Park as a working group chair for the healthcare working group. We also added here recently Master Builders Association of Pierce County, and finally, the Lakewood Chamber has become a member of SSMCP after a long hiatus. Task 5, inform and educate stakeholders on military impacts across the South Puget Sound. We have collectively engaged with numerous organizations for local to national level with presentations, office visits, and supported local government with our grant studies. Task 6, this last year we did our first ever SSMCP members survey. We found out that the function that we perform that is most valuable to our members is our regional legislative advocacy work. 54% of our members say that's our most valuable function for them. We also have a notable legislative win last year with the creation at the state level of a Defense Community Compatibility Account, which was championed by Senator Conway, but it took quite a bit of work to get that approved. That account's established, and now this year we're asking for funding for the program manager position, which they didn't provide in last year's legislation. And next year we'll be asking for $15 million to put in the account. And the reason that's important is that Department of Commerce was tasked in the legislation to manage this new DCCA account. And they put together a list of projects that were submitted by communities this last winter. That list was published after a legislative report was prepared, and SSMCP has 3 projects that were prioritized by the Department of Commerce as number 1, number 2, and number 4. And the city has a project that was prioritized 5th. On task 7, we just completed a local business survey this year, and we'll complete a new economic impact analysis this May. We will also next year in 21, conduct a JBLM workforce survey again. The last one we did was 2018, so this will be a catch-up for the last 3 years. And then task 8. This remains an ongoing effort for SSMCP, but our working groups are formed and active in social services, healthcare, and education. SSMCP Education, Healthcare, and Social Services working groups will participate in and support the 2020 Military and Civilian Services Summit on 23 April at the McGavick Center. We have a number of keynote speakers. Madigan Army Medical Center Commander Colonel Tom Bunt, the JBLM Garrison Commander Colonel Sky Duncan, the Pierce County Executive, the Deputy Mayor of Lakewood, and Alfie Alvarado from WDVA. Some of that work will talk about attainable housing for service members. And this group also continues to advocate for child care advocacy, because child care, from our previous surveys, ends up being a mortgage payment for a lot of these younger service members. Lastly, our way ahead, just wanted to show you quickly, while they're modest gains, we're still on an upwards streak here over the last 3 years in our membership dues. And really, we're funded by membership dues and grants, so that's pretty important to us. And we have some work that I mentioned earlier in a local transportation study, conservation, partnering, and banking, and affordable housing for service members. We will conclude this summer. And then I mentioned the November 2020 Elected Officials Council is when our next work plan will be approved. And with that, I turn it over for questions.
Questions from Mr. Adamson? Mr. Branstetter.
Thanks, Mayor. Mr. Adamson, when I'm looking at the core objectives and benchmarks, and over the years, much of we have been done has had either directly or in the background to sustain the trainability resources at JBLM and take actions that deal with avoiding adverse consequences of a BRAC. And I guess, as you know, we've had these same benchmarks for a long time, you know, and as we've matured, are there some plans in the next year, in the 21-20, to look at updating those, to look at that? For instance, we're moving into a conservation primarily task this year that doesn't fit exactly into any of these 6, but it fits into the readiness and the effectiveness of the installation to keep you know, a mission capable force. I would just suggest that you could want to look at that, to just make sure that as we take on new things, that we can somehow tie them to something that's on this list, and if the list needs an addition, would be my thought.
Sure. So 2010 was quite a while ago, and the conditions on the base today are quite different than they were in 2010. That massive growth that we saw in the early 2000s has subsided. I will tell you, though, that in the next 18 months, JBLM is going to grow by about 2,700 more active duty members. There's a couple new headquarters coming in. One's a signals headquarters, brigade level, and another is what they call a multi-domain brigade. So there is growth. And so when I checked with the Office of Economic Adjustment, because many of the tasks that we've been completing the last 4.5 years were actually not generated by the Growth Coordination Plan. They were generated by the 2015 JBLM Joint Land Use Study. And so we've been focused a lot on land use issues that came out of that study. That's now 5 years old as well. And so I think what we're going to do here in 2020, end of 2020, is go back to OEA and look to refresh on there's a couple different approaches. We could actually do an assessment of how well have we done with the 2010 Growth Coordination Plan. We could ask, because we have enough growth with 2,700 new servicemen coming in, we could ask to do another growth coordination plan. Or we could take a hybrid approach and look at, hey, we've done all the recommendations that came out of the 2015 JLUS. Maybe we need to do another JLUS. They call it something different now, but they say every 5 years you should come around and look for that. So there are ways to get to what you're asking for. It's just a matter of us presenting that to our steering committee and getting a decision out of that body.
So just to add to your concerns, this morning I received an email from the Association of Defense Communities to the Federal Outreach and Advisory Committee, basically the lobbying committee. We were asked to our input with respect to a particular senator's proposed bill that would require DOD to study the shared infrastructure vulnerability at its basis and engraft that somehow onto the NDAA for next year, which without apparent funding source. There was kind of universal concerns that this wasn't a good idea, basis competing against, communities competing against communities, the possibility that OEA would be charged without being budgeted for it, charged with coming up with a way to do this, and so I think there's going to be a wait and see on the part of ADC. That it was an outreach from the senator's office to see through John Conger, to see if ADC would be interested in backing it, and I don't think that's going to happen, at least in its present form. But and there was also some concern that it would dip into DSIP. I mean, there was.
And I had an email today, just so you know. There's something called the Sustaining Military Readiness Conference. It's held about every 2 or 3 years. This one's going to be in San Antonio, and it's put on by OEA. And they have asked us to come again and talk about the McCord Clear Zone in another panel. So it's the August timeframe, so it's not the best time to go to San Antonio, but we will be going to support that as well.
I don't know what is a good time. We went down there and didn't get a ray of sunshine. Any other questions?
Looks good.
Thanks, Bill. We now move to Mr. Gum for rental housing safety program update. Yeah, do some tea. Tea? Yes. You don't have to, yeah, thanks.
All right. Good evening, Mr. Mayor, Deputy Mayor, and members of the council. Today, I'm going to be giving you an update as to the rental housing program for 2019. Would like to go through a number of topics and then end with some questions if you have for me. So what I'd like to go through this year is the overview for year-end registration, go through some property maps, kind of show you some registration trends that we've seen, common inspection items that failed, and then kind of wrap it up and show you some of the improvements that we've seen in the rental housing program. So this is a map of the city of Lakewood, and you can see registered versus unregistered properties. I took the exempt last year. I showed you the exempt properties and is in this as well. Some of the exempts kind of weighed the map down because there's some presumption on what we assumed were rentals and what we weren't, and the real important data is what's registered and what's not registered for the city. And this year, the green is starting to outweigh the red, so we're starting to go in the right direction. For registration this year, it was fairly consistent this year to last year. We ended up with a 72% registered rate. Last year was 66%. Registered rental units, again, there's an 89%. Last year was about 85%. We did clean up some of the registration numbers that we had. There was a number of properties that last year we were counting as unregistered, and some of them were owner occupied, some of them had PO boxes. There was some diligence that we had to do to go in and kind of get rid of some of those properties that we thought were rentals. So in this year, there was a number of properties that we learned were exempt or just weren't rentals, so we cleaned that out of the system.
Just a quick question, Mr. Gum, does this new number in 2019 include new units that have come on the market?
No, it
New
does not.
inventory that's been built, so this is based on old inventory, not the
Correct.
new completed inventory?
This is old inventory, and if you're within 10 years of new construction, you don't have to register. You're
exempt.
considered exempt,
Okay.
so we haven't
Okay.
counted those yet.
Got it. That's right.
But do we have an exempt number? I mean, we have registered, unregistered, and exempt are the three categories.
I do have an exempt number. I didn't bring it toward me tonight, but I'd be happy to get it to you and email it to you all. It's fairly consistent with what it was last year. It's a little bit higher because we were using, like I said, Pierce County data that we assumed some numbers are rentals, so it's higher than it was last year because there was some in-house cleaning of.
For the next time you come back and update us, if you could list all three, then that would give us essentially a total number of properties.
Sure. Registration by properties, by and large, the majority of the rental properties, actual properties themselves, not the units, are single family. There's a number of larger rental properties that have registered this year, fairly consistent with last year.
52.
Inspections by property type, so I'm going to go through the initial inspections that we did and then the re-inspections. So the next three slides are the initial inspections. So this year, what I saw a little bit more so than last year was the private inspectors have stepped up and started to do a little bit more inspections. So the first year, we assumed that there wouldn't be that many private inspections done. And as property owners get used to the system and learn who those people are, they've started to use them. The other issue is that there's only so many inspections that can be conducted by city staff. So if the units want to get inspected and on a certain schedule that maybe we can't meet, then they were going to the private side to do that. So last year, we did 311 inspections. The private inspectors did 148. Last year, in 2018, we did 499 inspections, so it was fairly similar. The mix that we're seeing, single family and multifamily, it's representative of the mix of the city of Lakewood. So primarily 52% of Lakewood's rental versus 48. So those numbers are fairly consistent. Initial inspection results are coming back fairly consistent with what they were last year. So this is initial properties at inspection and initial units at inspection. So last year we saw 411 properties with a failed inspection, 1,180 units failed. So the percentages are fairly close, 92% versus 87%, and 84% versus 90%. A lot of the failed units tend to be multifamily. It's a inspection checklist where you, in essence, pass all or fail one, and you have to fix the units. So multifamilies are going to fail at a higher percentage rate than a single family, where when you're looking at multiple opportunities to have to meet the inspection checklists. Re-inspections, this actually jumped up considerably from last year. So last year we did 221 inspections. This year we did 321 inspections, and all re-inspections are conducted by city staff. So this is where a lot of the staff time was taken up this year, kind of going through a lot of the re-inspections. Again, it's fairly consistent with the 48 and 52% inspection. Property re-inspection results, this is what we'd like to see. You take properties from red and you turn them to blue in this case. So you have a property that was failed, and in the same cycle you move it to a passed. So we saw in the previous year a 92% pass rate, 88% this year. The numbers are fairly consistent. They're a little bit lower this year. The passed units, again, 76 to 78% last year. 187 of those units remain failed. Some of the common things that we have seen failed, it's again consistent with last year. There's a few changes, but fairly consistent. We saw last year fewer electrical issues this year. We're seeing some more electrical issues that are not necessarily related to GFIs. You've got issues with open wiring and circuits and all kinds of things. So saw a little bit of an increase in those. The smoke detectors, GFCIs, water heaters, those things again tend to kind of dominate the failed list. We do continue, when smoke detectors are out, we continue to encourage the apartment complexes to ask the fire department. They have a grant that does still install those smoke detectors in, and they continue to do that for us. The one thing that I would point out is, with additional inspections by the private side inspectors, we've taken on some additional training with those private inspectors, because most of them come from a background of banking or real estate inspections. So our rental inspection is a little different than you would be if you're buying or selling a house. So we recently had a mandatory inspection to kind of go through some of the variations. We were noticing things that they were calling out versus things that we were calling out. So we wanted to go in and require all of those inspectors to go through a training. So we did a 2.5, 3-hour training, kind of went through what we're expecting to see on the checklist, figured out what they were expecting of us, of the checklist, and kind of brought everybody on the same page. So that was about a month and a half ago. So we're starting to see a little bit better consistency in what we're inspecting as a city inspection versus what the private side was doing. Some of the things that are kind of interesting, some of the big properties, the private inspectors had the largest unit property that passed an initial inspection, and they had the largest property that failed an initial inspection. I believe it was the same inspector, actually. In the city of Lakewood, we had a fairly large property that passed a re-inspection. Whoa, getting some weird feedback. So the property that we inspected was Forest Village. It failed the same, I don't know, probably about 2 or 3 months before, and then we went back and inspected a fairly large complex, and it passed. The property that failed that the city inspected the largest would be a 55 unit. Both of those failed properties are still doing inspection or reworking to get re-inspection, so they have not passed yet, but they're working on it. That's the weirdest feedback. A slide that I thought is kind of interesting when you, as I mentioned, you want to take properties and see when you're, to me, an effective program would be you take people from a failed state and you move them to a passed state, and you do that relatively quickly and efficiently. This slide kind of shows that. So in 2019, we were looking at, you can see failure rates, fairly significant. However, in the same year, we're moving them to passed. So we're taking units that clearly were substandard or had issues and eliminating those issues and moving them into a safe condition.
Mr. Whalen, just a quick question, Mr. Gum.
You're getting the same thing I am.
That better? So when a property fails an inspection, either initially or on a re-inspection, are the tenants notified? And if so, how?
They are not. Just the property owner is notified, or the property manager is notified. The only time a property owner or tenant would know is if it's a single-family house or a duplex. I mean, if you're going through and they're gonna, typically they follow us around when we do the inspection, so they're gonna know that somebody's passed or not. The same goes for a multifamily, would for a single family. They tend to follow us around, so they wanna know what things need to get fixed. So I mean, they know things need to be fixed on their property, but they don't necessarily know the entire property is passed or failed.
So if we've got a re-inspection, so arguably they've been given a second bite of the apple, and they fail to pass the re-inspection, is there a level of materiality where we say, it really is a health safety issue? It's not a GFI, which I'm not disputing right now, isn't a health or safety issue, but some are more material than others. Do we have occasions where there have been material defects that have been notably failed or have failed, notably on the re-inspection? And if so, what do we do? I mean, if the tenant is in an unsafe circumstance with a material defect that is yet to be corrected, one wonders how beneficial is the program?
for those tenants?
Yeah, we have. I wouldn't say anything that was life-threatening or anything along those means. Typically, if we find those units, our repair timeline's fairly short. We haven't had anybody fail that had significant issues that, at least in my
Okay.
opinion, or in the inspector's opinion, would threaten somebody's life. I mean, there have been issues they needed to fix, but not rising to that level. There have been properties that take a while to fix. I mean, if later we'll go through some of the slides and you can see some of the repairs. I mean, some of them have taken months and months and months,
Right.
but
Some of the deck
typically,
issues and
yeah,
such.
we address those as we come across them. One thing that, well, I guess we'll go to this one. The one thing that kind of ties into that, something that we have seen on properties this year and even into last year, some of the properties that we've had issues with and have had landlords for, I guess for better use of the words, maybe didn't care about their properties or were looking at them as money properties versus people actually living in those, have kind of turned over. We've seen some interesting property sales. One that jumps out at me very clearly was a fellow, Jeff Marinchak. He's from California, bought 2 properties. One Tudor house, McCord Tudor house, and the other one was Whispering Firs. He called us within a month or 2 of purchasing those properties. I asked him if he'd ever seen those properties. He said he bought them sight unseen, but was determined to make those properties work, and he has been true to his word. He's gone out and completely redone those properties. When I mentioned those to the police department, when we do CSRT meetings, that he purchased those, they were kind of excited, but kind of standoffish to see what happened, and he's turned those properties around. He's fixed them. He's gotten rid of the problem tenants. One of those Whispering Firs was a property that I've been very near, and there was 2 shootings at it. Both times I was near the property, so those issues have been corrected. So we're seeing landlords who may not necessarily want to maintain their properties sell their properties, and we're getting landlord and owners that are starting to take care of them. Some of the other things that we've seen is there's a property maintenance company, a local company, and we've never been able to convince them necessarily that it's a good deal. But we have had inspections, both Heather and myself, with some of their property managers, and 2 of them have told us, hey, you know, we're understanding the program. I see where you're going. I get it. We can see what the big picture is. Clearly, our company doesn't agree with it, but it was interesting talking to them and getting a different perspective. So we are starting to see some property managers that may not have been on board originally. They're starting to get on board. We've had a fairly positive tenant relationship. There's only been maybe 2 tenants. One who just simply said that he would not let us in because we're trampling on his right to privacy, and that's okay. We just inspected a different unit. Another tenant who just, for whatever reason, didn't want us in their complex. So when we run into those, we just pick another unit and move on to the next. It's fairly simple, but the tenants have been positive. This slide, one of the tenants that I was at, actually on the 3rd floor, you can see that a middle slide is a bike. The tenant called, this is Village at Sealy Lake. The tenant had been trying to get his landlord to fix these decks for a number of years. And when I walked out on the deck, you can see it's not very clear, but behind the bike is a little bit of a gap behind, the deck is peeling away from the siding. So, yeah. So when we went out and looked at this complex, so you've got siding, or the deck is starting to fall off. The front of it was starting to fail and get somewhat rot. This is kind of hard to show with the thing, but the post at the bottom was also rotten, and it was actually collapsing. So this deck was sinking and falling away from the building. When we went and inspected, there was probably another 10 to 15 buildings that we saw that were very similar in condition. So all of those, they posted them. They boarded up the outside door so nobody could get out, and they have since been working on these things to this day. This is the slide kind of in progress. You can see the work that they were doing on the deck. So they literally tore the entire face off. This all had a bunch of water getting into it. They had to completely rebuild the decks, the pony walls at the top, and redo all those. You can see how they are now. So again, I don't know the exact valuation of repairs. I could find that out, but my estimation is it's well in excess of $700,000. I mean, if you're looking at 40 or 50 decks at, I don't know, $8,000, $9,000 a pop, I mean, that's just deck repairs, and then you've got all the other issues that they're doing for siding and
If I can
insulation.
add something here, this project was constructed in 1995.
Yeah,
So
fairly
it's
new.
a relatively new apartment tower.
And the bad thing is when we were walking around with the property maintenance manager, he was talking about, he just started, but 2 years before they'd been given an award for the most efficient maintenance crew or whatever. So they didn't spend any money to maintain their building for 2 years, which unfortunately kind of led to this. Another property that we went out and inspected, Hawaiian Village Apartments. This is a deck on one of the units. It doesn't really show how horribly rotted this deck was, but the entire deck, I walked on it and I barely was able to get on it, and it was starting to creak and fall apart. The third-story deck was completely rotten. The stairs were completely rotten. It was absolutely unsafe for somebody to walk on. And somebody was living in that third story, so this is something that we had them address and get on. So this was fixed. They had to completely redo the deck. Another repair that was done at the same Thunderbird Parkway Apartments, or Hawaiian Village, the railings, it doesn't show up very well, but there's a little bit of, you can see kind of wrinkling on the wood. So water had been running through this deck. It rotted the beams out. It rotted the support structure out. They had to completely reframe that thing, put rails on it. It was leaking from, where'd my pointer go? The roof. You can see they replaced a piece of fascia up here. So the water was literally running down here and in the back and kind of going through. So they had to do some repairs on this. A property that we went to, this was a 5-unit housing complex on Pac Highway 8410. So this had a number of rental issues. This was one that Mr. Maloney and I went and inspected. I think this was his very first inspection. So they actually had, a lot of the units, they literally had extension cords that would run into walls and out of walls, and we couldn't figure out where they went, why they were going. You can't run an extension cord through a wall. We couldn't figure out where they were going. They had in the inside of this unit, when I was in there, I could see the ceiling had kind of dropped a little and it wasn't properly connected, and you could see water streaks down the wall. What happened is that wall probably, at some point in time, was completely leaking water into the house. That thing got stripped off and rebuilt, no permits, no inspections. I don't know what they did for framing. I don't know what they did for anything. So we had that house posted unsafe. It had, most of these units had electrical outlets that kind of looked like that when they were broken and falling apart. And yeah, each of these had Hispanic families with multiple children in them, and that they were not in the greatest condition. Bathroom, you can see the bathtub on the left. They stuck vinyl on the walls. It's completely open, unsealed. The floor is rotten around the tub. The stairwell that went to the basement in one of the units, that's probably the worst set of stairs I've ever seen. There was no rail on the fall side. The stairs were way too steep, way too narrow. The landings I mean, nothing complied on this thing. On the right, we actually saw this in I think 3 or 4 of the units. For some reason, when their baseboard heaters failed, they taped them over and painted them, and I'm not certain what that accomplished. It made them look like the walls. They didn't have heat in multiple units because they failed. So this apartment complex, ultimately, this is kind of what happens sometimes if you go in and there's multiple levels of failure. This is one where we talked to the landlord and said, hey, here's the issues you need to fix. A lot of these are life safety. These people cannot live in here, and we actually relocated all the tenants from this complex. And these remain boarded up. It's actually a different zoning, so the owner's considering demolishing them and going a different route with this property. Something else that we encountered on the property was an abandoned contractor yard. We find these kind of often when we do rental housing. It kind of turns into other issues. So this one, I worked with the contractor who's still there. He's retired at this point in time to clean up his property. So when I showed up, there was all kinds of debris. There was all kinds of vehicles, broken down things, and he removed most of that. And I think he's finished it this month.
Just a quick clarifying question. So with regard to the last slide and the comment about the need to relocate certain tenants, what funds do we use for that, and do they get recouped from the landlord once they do something for their property?
They do get recovered. So we used, in this case, I believe I used CDBG relocation. We could potentially also use the dangerous building abatement
So we've
fund.
got a little bit of a pot of money if this rare situation comes up.
Yes, and those do come back, and if they don't, there's a 12% interest. It's the same as an abatement lien if we had to
So it is
file.
assessed against the property and becomes a super priority lien?
It is.
Okay, good.
And we've had very good success in collecting those. We've never had one not pay us back. And usually when you send the landlords the letter and they see the provisions in RCW, they pretty much comply and pay the tenants. So the contractor yard that was cleaned up, this was a single-family house on 34th Avenue. This was a private inspector who went out and inspected this property, and this just shows one side of the house. The entire house was peeling pretty much like that around the entire perimeter, so it was one that they came in and repainted the entire house, fixed up some windows, redid the trim. There was some interior stuff, but this was a kind of a dilapidated property when they started, and it's a fairly nice property now. Something that we see quite often, this is a post, and this is an actual carport. So what happens is they pour posts in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and they stay there for a number of years. Usually what happens is the dirt slowly builds up and then water starts to collect on them. So this post on the left is one that had rotted out. Fairly simple fix. They go in and pour a new footing and put a little saddle on it and correct the post. If you don't, ultimately at some point in time, this construction starts to fail. Some of the common things that we have seen and that we continue to see, the slide on the left, we tend to find exposed wiring a lot. And what happens is typically they'll come in and they'll either install it inside the framing or they'll put flex conduit on it. So this was a repair where they put flex conduit on it, a GFCI outlet installation, water heater installation, the seismic straps, and the overflow, and this one had to be redone. Stairway railings in a lot of units, we find out that there either are no stairway railings or they've been removed, so that's something that we have installed in units. And then smoke detectors and carbon monoxide detectors are something we see often. Something that I wanted to point out, a nice apartment complex, and try and, rather than point out all the bad, and show you guys, this was a complex that was inspected. It was very nearly impeccably maintained. Very nice complex, very nice tenants, very nice management. Wanted to point out that there are fantastic properties in Lakewood, and this is one of them. So moving forward, where we are today, we've mailed out inspection letters for the 2020 lottery. Something that I thought was interesting when we did the lottery and pulled multifamily properties, we got 14 properties with 51 units. And I thought, that doesn't sound right. So I plugged in a different number on lottery and hit the lottery button, and it pulled up 14 properties with 51 units. Did it a third time, 14 properties with 51 units. So going back and looking where we're at, with the inspections that we've done and the lotteries that we've done and the code inspections that have kind of complied or we've had to comply with, we've kind of gone through almost all of the multifamily properties in the city of Lakewood. So we have either inspected all of them except for those 14, or they're on an inspection list and they have not yet scheduled. So I did not expect to get through as many multifamily properties as we have in 3 years. The reason being that we've gone through them all so fast is we've had mandated inspections. So usually when we have complaints, they tend to come from multifamily properties versus single family. So we've kind of ended up just focusing on those properties based on getting complaints. The registration deadline is March 31st, 2020. Enforcement, we are going to start doing non-compliant 2018 properties. We still have a number of properties, I believe it's 76, that have not registered in 2018. They've continued to not register in 2019, and we've sent them letter after letter, and we've sent them nice letters and then kind of nice letters, and now they're getting not nice letters at all. So we got a lot of response this last letter. They got one that, yeah, it talks about all kinds of bad penalties, and I think about a third of them have stepped up and registered. There's still, I think the largest complex that hasn't registered is, I think, 42 units. So we're getting pretty good compliance, but my guess is there'll be 20 to 25 that are just not going to register. We're going to follow up. I was talking about with correction deficiencies from 18 and 19. Some of the properties, and actually a lot of the properties that we work with, will call in and ask for extensions, and, I mean, they're doing construction, so their contractors can't get there, their windows don't come in, the weather's too rainy, and there's all kinds of things. So we've worked with those complexes to kind of push them out and keep them going. We are going to continue to do the code-triggered violations. This last year, we did 16 property inspections. I believe they represented about 130 or 135 units. We are going to work on updating the rental housing portal and continuing to monitor inspections and see where we are. Oh, one other thing that I probably should have told you as we were going through the slides. The one thing that we try and do when we work with these complexes is assess whether it really is life safety or it's something that can kind of just be put off and maybe delayed and focus on other inspection items and work with them. We also work with these complexes rather than come out and do an inspection. If somebody fails for, I mean, something simple as like numbers on their building, we have some of that going on. Or if they've got one smoke detector in one bedroom or GFIs or just little easy things that they can send us videos. We have a number of them sending us videos now where we don't necessarily have to go back out. So we'll have a landlord walk through and they'll go through the door and they'll take a video. Hey, here's my front bedroom, here's a smoke detector, test it. Here's my back bedroom, take the smoke detector and test it. Rather than having us go back out and inspect for a number of these units, it saves them a re-inspection fee. It also saves us time to actually go out and have to do it. So we've got a number of those units complying that way. Yes, when we leave the inspection, they know going out that, hey, you either need to send us a video or we need to come back and do an inspection on those. So we try and work with as many as we can to take videos. If it's something that's life safety that we need to put our eyeballs and hands on to make sure something's properly constructed, then we're out there doing it. Any questions?
Ms. Moss?
Thank you. Going back to where you talked about there was 2 units that refused to let you in.
Mm-hmm.
If there's a safety issue and something happens, is the city responsible? Or does it go back to the landlord?
That's a good question. I think that would be a question for legal. My guess would be it's probably going to be the landlord's responsibility. I mean, we're under a program, we only inspect a percentage of the units anyways. If we do find other issues, we go back in and inspect multiple units, so we could. But that would probably be a question for legal.
If I understand the question correctly, it's to what degree do we own some liability if we're inspecting the buildings? The inspection is for bare minimum safety, so it doesn't guarantee, as indicated, that the whole building is safe. That being said, obviously, anytime somebody can pull the city into something, they will, because we're considered to be a deep pocket. But our defense would be that we're not guaranteeing craftsmanship or anything of that nature. We are simply inspecting for a minimal standard. It wouldn't be substantially different than when we inspect a building and say it's safe for occupancy. It should be somewhat comparable than that, if anything, a little less even.
So you would have a record of that house being refusal to let you in, is that?
Yes, on our inspection report, we keep handwritten notes.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Mr. Branstetter.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Mr. Gum, exempt properties, and I know the one category is if you build something new, it's exempt for the decade. But there are other reasons why a property could be exempt. For instance, it's being inspected due to some other program or that. How do we track that an exempt property is still exempt when it's one of those other types of exemptions? Like I think if it had a Section H voucher or something like that, what's our process to revalidate that exemption?
I haven't had any multifamilies exempt yet. We've had a couple of them that came in. They do have Section 8 vouchers. The inspection checklist for a Section 8 voucher is called Housing Quality Standards, and it doesn't necessarily arise to the level of our inspection. So we have had those units inspected with our rental housing safety program versus theirs. So we haven't had any with the exemption for government standards for comparable inspections. We have had families, typically what we see for exemptions is family members living in a household. So it's my mom or my grandma or sorry, my mom or my son typically is what we see, or my daughter. There are units where the owners clearly are not renting them. I mean, we've had a number of those. It tends to be a little bit more germane issues for exemptions, something that would be more common than rental inspections for a multifamily complex. We don't have any of those right now, but we do track those. I mean, it's typically what, at least where we're going is on a 5-year cycle, we'll go back in and literally do a complete analysis of all of the data and try and figure out new rental properties. We have to, the thing is the data's limited, so we go to the Pierce County Assessor's website and we literally go through all the properties in the city of Lakewood, try and figure out, multifamilies are a given. I mean, you've got multiple properties. You've got single families and duplexes that are a little bit more complex. So on a 5-year cycle, we're gonna go back in and update the data and check for owner occupied and other exemptions.
Okay. Earlier, the deputy mayor asked you about if occupants, renters were notified if a property had passed or failed. How do you deal with if you don't tell them anything, how do you deal with the perception that they'll assume that it passed?
I think it's clear when we leave that they have things, I mean, we let the tenants know because, like I said, they typically follow us around. So I think it's clear that there are things that they have to fix on the property. I don't necessarily know that they know the whole property has failed. They are aware that my unit has X number of things that will be fixed, and we will come out and follow up with those to make sure that they're done. So we make sure that they know that. Beyond that, we don't officially notify the tenants that a property has or has not failed. You can look on the city's website, on our rental housing portal, and find out registered properties. We have not put the properties that have passed or failed on that. That's something that we could do. It'd be an easy thing to do if we wanted to do that. It's an option.
Have you had any discussions with community development with Ms. Newton, okay, about how we can take the existence of your program and its performance as a part of being able to promote the city of Lakewood for either a place to move to, a place to rent in, or a place to become the owner of rental properties?
Not recently. We had that conversation when we started the program. I haven't talked to Becky very recently. One of the thoughts that I've kind of bounced off of Becky in years past was kind of having a kind of the list of shame and the list of good properties. So, I mean, you could list, hey, here's all the properties in Lakewood that have passed, here's the benefits, and here's, that is something that I am considering, and I will probably follow up with Becky in a very short period of time.
Well, earlier in this meeting, we had Mr. Adamson here, and he talked that they are initiating a study and a work to try to help identify and evaluate the properties that are particularly available for enlisted military personnel or enlisted military personnel, and of finding some way to leverage to say that rental properties in Lakewood, okay, are not just out there being maintained at the whim of the landlord, but that there is a program. So maybe within that SSMCP effort this year, there is a way to, go back on the perception, because we can go back a decade of where housing managers on JBLM were advising folks not to look to rent in Lakewood. And, your program is a way to advertise that it's there to the extent that it's made a difference in the quality of being able to go and do that. And then I guess my last question is, the letters you're sending to the 2018 non-registered properties, are you asking to recover 3 years' worth of registration fees or just get registered for 2020?
It depends on the property. The units that haven't registered since 18 and 19 and have not changed hands, we're asking them to pay the full fee. If a property sells somewhere in the interim, we're not making the new owners go back and pay us those fees just from the year that they purchased it forward. And, I mean, ultimately, it depends on the property. We have at times, if they asked us to forgive the fees due to extenuating circumstances, I've done that as well, so. There's been a couple of occasions where individuals said they did not get letters because they went to a PO box versus something else, and it was in California, and rather than deal with all of that, it's easier just to get them into compliance, get their units inspected, and move them on. That's the point of this program, so.
Well, one of the things that I would want to point out to you and your team is that when we had a retreat on Saturday, and one of the areas was we talked about what was going well and what as a city we would be proud of, and your program was one of those things that fell into that category.
It's great to hear. One thing I like to kind of tag on, I'll give you 1 second, Dave, that I guess would work, and as you're talking, it kind of a light went on in my head, but Becky has done the business showcases. Something like that would be kind of nice to do with the rental housing. I mean, I showed you a perfectly good property here at the end, do a rental housing showcase where we could every month put up another one. Hey, here's another fantastic property that we have in the city of Lakewood. Hey, here's another one that we have. So I mean, there are a number of them. I'm certain that most of those owners would be happy to be the showcase apartment complex.
Mr. Whalen?
Well, again, I appreciate the good information and update. I just want to get into a few fly specks in the pepper. You probably saw one of the emails I received from some constituents, and there was a question about the breadth of the inspection checklist, and it may be the result of a private inspector doing more bank-type lender inspections versus the city inspections. But some of the concerns I had were comments and dings about fencing or vegetation. Those really aren't the focused life and safety issues that we were contemplating. So are we still doing that on our checklist? I didn't see it on the checklist we had.
No, that was I can't remember the specific property, but I sent them an email yesterday.
This was Lawndale.
Yeah, 91 something Lawndale.
9402, 9414 Lawndale.
So, yeah, that property was, I think, inspected in 18 or late 18, I believe. I can't remember the exact inspection date. And that was a private inspector, and we have since, in the training that we provided about 2 months ago, that was one of the things that we went through. Hey, our checklist talks about overgrown vegetation. Overgrown, I look at it from a code perspective. That means to me blackberries and brambles and weeds everywhere.
Right.
To them, that means your shrubs are overgrown and they're touching your house. So I had to explain to them, hey, think about the city's perspective, not a poor landscaper's perspective, somebody who's not doing what they're supposed to be doing. So we've corrected that.
Got it. Tenants blocking egress windows with their own bed sets. Is that a ding on the landlord, or is that a ding on the tenant?
That's a ding on the tenant. What happens, every once in a while, you'll get somebody who's put I've seen it a couple of times, a giant bed in front of a window where the head, you can't even get out the window. That's one level of blocking. That one I would probably suggest to the tenant, hey, you know what are you gonna do if a fire starts in this unit? I mean, it's your house. I mean, do whatever you wanna do, but when this place catches on fire, you're not getting out that window. So we don't enforce that. That's another thing that, it's one thing if there's no way to get out of your house because someone's storing all kinds of stuff in a bedroom. It's another thing. My bedroom when I was growing up as a kid, I had a bed right in front of the window because it's where the sun came up in the morning. I wanted to be there, so I just climb on my bed and get out. That actually makes it easier to get out.
We have had issues with hoarder rentals.
Yes.
And hoarder rentals, and in that particular case, we want to make sure that there is proper egress to a window.
Sure.
So just move your stuff so that we can see that access point.
Those are the types of situations that I would hope that we are using good discretion when we charge or don't charge for the reinspection fee when these kinds of things come up.
Yeah, and when I looked at that property inspection, there was a number of things that we needed to put our eyeballs back on, but by and large, there was a lot that they could send photos. And I believe the inspection, we reduced the inspection fee from, I think, 8 or 9 units down to 3. What happens is you look at kind of what you need to re-inspect and how long it's gonna take you to re-inspect, and then we can adjust the fees accordingly.
What about there was one last one he had a comment on that I didn't know about, but there was a comment on a different older fiveplex he managed that there was some sort of requirement to upgrade electrical panels in 4 of the 5 units, and that was a capital expense of about 12 grand for that particular owner. Would that be something we would normally do, is require an upgrade to electrical panels? If there wasn't otherwise any other permitted activity to upgrade the unit that would require bringing it up to code?
Yeah, I didn't look at that unit specifically. I looked into it, but I couldn't figure out why they were required. I mean, what can happen is if they install panels and there isn't the proper clearances. I mean, you're supposed to have 3 feet clearance.
Okay, so it could have been a clearance issue.
So it may have been a clearance issue. It may have been that maybe when they were installed, they were never inspected. Usually when you go out and find a panel that's installed, there's usually a green tag on it that somebody signs off on.
Right, L&I or something.
We often go out and find panels that have been replaced that were never inspected.
Got it.
It's an inspector's call on those. Does he think it was installed properly? Does it look safe? Do the breakers look fine? I mean, you can kind of look at that and see, hey, if this thing was installed 2 years ago, are there arc fault breakers? I mean, are there certain things that an electrical contractor would do properly versus, say, somebody who doesn't know what they're doing and just throw in a panel and call it close enough?
Thank you.
I'd like to go back to a question that Mr. Branstetter approached about marketing the rental housing program. I've been reluctant to do it because for a while I considered this to be kind of a startup. I thought that by 5 years into this, we would be in a much better position to talk about that. But given the fact that we've so far along on the inspections and the number of multiple family units that are left, I mean, we're only into this for 2.5 years. The level of upgrade has been substantial in apartment complexes and housing in general in Lakewood. So it's definitely something that we should be talking about and promoting as part of Lakewood. So I would agree that we need to do something better than we have in the past. But that's why we've been slow.
Ms. Farmer.
Okay, so clarification question. So there's a lottery, and there's a certain number of letters that go out, and then a certain number that register, and then a certain number of inspections. See if I got that correct. So there were 459 inspections in 2019. What was the universe of that lottery cohort? How many could have happened had everybody registered?
In 2019, I believe we selected, I'm trying to remember how many properties we selected then, 550 roughly?
Okay.
650, sorry, 650, I believe. We try and do about 20% every year, so.
So that goes to my next point, is so that you're meeting the goals, you feel like you're setting yourself goals, or would you like to inspect more or less, or, I don't know.
I think we've done a pretty good job on inspecting the number of properties that are out there. I mean, obviously I'd like to inspect all of them. Some of it is just, people don't call us to inspect. So I mean, there's only so much that I can do to force somebody to inspect until I actually do code enforcement issues to force them. But I think we've done a pretty good job. I think this coming year, seeing the private inspectors inspecting more last year to this year, I expect that to continue. So maybe some of those reluctant properties will hire private inspectors and have them do them versus us if it's a city issue where they don't want us to come into their property. So I think we've done pretty good, and I think we'll see it improve next year.
There's about 13,298 rental units in the city of Lakewood. And of that, on a 5-year basis, we're looking to try to capture around 2,200 to 2,400 rental units. And so that's how we get to the 650 properties, I believe.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it's broken out. When the formula breaks it out to 52% multifamily, it's selecting for properties and 48% single family. So it tries to make that number work with the available properties.
Okay. My second question is, I hear from constituents, and I hear about the disparities between the private inspections and the city inspections, and I'm curious if there's been any thought, I'm not saying we need to, but has there been any thought to getting the word out to trade groups or industry, or word's gotten around that there's some disparity. And so now that that's been corrected, it would be nice to be able to let everybody know that. I don't know how you would manage that.
Yeah, we haven't gone out and done any notifications on that. We did do a little bit of research to kind of figure out why before we did the training with all of our contractors. So there was really 2 contractors who were kind of passing more so than anybody else. Their numbers were significantly different than anybody else. We have one private inspector, Todd Oberfeld, who's a Lakewood contractor, and he does, I don't know the number exactly. My guess is probably about 60 to 70% of the private inspections. The guy is inspecting everything, and he fails almost exactly the same rate as the city does. I mean, and especially since we did that last training, even those ones who were kind of passing more than we would have expected, they've kind of gone back into a little bit more norm. Some of the things that they were doing, though, is they were doing pre-inspections. So they would go out to a property and inspect whatever units and charge them, and then they would come back, and then they would do what was in essence a re-inspection and call it a past initial inspection. So some of their numbers weren't necessarily correct, which I told them, I mean, that's one thing to do, but it kind of skews what I'm trying to understand when we're collecting data. If you're not telling me truly what you're doing, that doesn't help me to understand the problem.
Right, all right, thank you.
So to move to my GFI question, and here, I think you guys are doing a great job, don't get me wrong. My concern is regulatory creep. We were very definite when we were discussing this, that we wanted this to be, focus on the main thing, general safety. It wasn't going to be cosmetic. It wasn't going to be things mostly that the tenants did, how they lived. It was going to be life safety. And whether or not GFCIs are a good idea, you start with the basic proposition in the code that existing materials can stay and that you can replace existing materials with like kind if it's just a swap. And it's not a universal rule, but pretty close. So what triggers telling a property manager or landlord that has 50 units that they have to spend more than $25,000 to put 2 GFIs in every unit?
Take it, or do you want me to take it?
Go ahead.
So when we did the initial inspection checklist, I mean, we went to the property maintenance code. So we looked at literally what we considered were life safety issues. That was when we had Nancy Craig, the previous building official, and went through, she and I kind of prioritized what was important and what we thought was not important. That was something at that point in time was important to the building official. The issue with a GFI wasn't necessarily, at least this was our discussion, wasn't necessarily something from a fire safety hazard. It was more of a life safety hazard. So if you have an appliance located within 6 feet of a water source, which in essence is a sink, and an appliance were to fall into that, or you were to ground it into some form of water, the GFCI at that outlet trips the breaker, or trips itself versus the breaker, and it shuts the power off immediately. So it was something that we looked at. It's an immediate life safety thing. You can truly stop somebody from creating a ground fault into themselves with a $12 to $20 breaker. That was something that we determined was something that we would like to see in the program, so that was put into the program. It does follow current electrical codes. I mean, if you are doing a new house and you're doing construction, those are still things that are in the code now that you still have to bring those things, or you still have to construct to that code. So it's something that code professionals now still see as a life safety issue. So that's how we brought that into the checklist.
So it's effectively a change to our building code, but we're only applying it to certain people.
It didn't change the building code. It was something that we added to the rental housing
I said it
code.
effectively changed the building code. Because the building code says you can use like-kind materials, and if you were complied with code at the time, it's an administrative change. And I feel strongly that that's the council's purview, and it should be applied universally. It may be greatest idea, And for example, smoke detectors are better hardwired. Fire people here, they know that. Are we gonna retroactively tell everybody in the city that they have to hardwire their smoke detectors? And is it up to the council to change the code or do it administratively? I feel very strongly that those are policy decisions that have to come to the council, because we're the ones that took the heat to adopt this program and then to be effectively blindsided by something like that. Like I said, not that it's necessarily a bad idea, but it has to be upfront and in the code that we're gonna do that. There are other examples in building where it's a good idea, or you're structurally more sound if you have 2x6s on your exterior walls, and you have modern tie downs with respect to your support structure for earthquakes. Are you gonna administratively require people to do that? Where's the line? The rules changed. The rules changed when I built my house 30 years ago, right in the middle. I had to revamp, but I wasn't inspected yet. Mr. Buer. An easy one.
An easy one. I am not the best person on something this technical, but I will say this: I respect the opinion of the mayor in this particular manner. We've had long discussions about the GFCI requirement. There are some cities that do require it as part of the rental housing program, and other cities that don't. When we talk about it, we went through and did a full building code analysis, looking at all the codes and trying to wrap it all together to say, is this an appropriate or reasonable approach? And when the city council did adopt the program, it did allow staff to create administrative rules, and this is one that we would require. However, if the council is of the opinion that this is going too far, that is overreach at this particular time, we're not opposed to amending your rule. In fact, it actually makes our program a little bit more easier to administer. But if you're asking us how we got here, that's how we did. And really, it's up to you as the council on this particular issue. This is really a judgment call. What does the council want to do?
And is there any other reach like that we don't know about?
This is the one that comes up the most.
It's 300 times, I guess.
Yes. Well, and let me also say that
That's not all GFCIs, it's GFCIs and outlets, so it's not, they're rolled in together, so it's a little bit less than 300, but yeah.
But when you take a look at GFCI's electrical issues as a total, they represent about 30% of the total number of failures. So that's something that we take a look at. But again, from the staff perspective, that's what we proposed. We were being cautious. This was a new program. And if we've moved along now that it's no longer necessary, I'd like to hear from the council.
One of the things I thought when I first heard about it was actually going back to your vegetation example. My experience with private inspectors for real estate closings is they require a separation between the vegetation and the siding, and they also require GFCIs in addition to the smoke detectors and CO2 detectors. Those are the three most common things that are repairs needed for a closing. So, Mr. Simpson.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Mr. Branstetter mentioned that on Saturday we had a retreat, and one of the questions we were asked was, what are we most proud of? And the first thing out of my mouth was the program you're talking about tonight, one of the things that we've accomplished as a council. And I appreciate the work and the honesty, Dave, in answering the mayor's question. And I agree. I think this is well-intentioned. It is an overstep. So I have one question to ask you, too.
Actually, three. This is Mr. Rafiq Gindi. He's our new building official. This is his inaugural visit to the city council.
Well, then, maybe I'll direct my question to you, sir. No, I'm not. My question is this. In the last 3 years, and I'm looking at you for a reason, Chief, how many people in Lakewood, Washington have been electrocuted? in a rental property with regard to water, which is what these things are designed to prevent.
And I can answer that question. 0.
Therefore, Occam's razor now comes out. Therefore, why do we expect rental property owners to install something in their properties when there is no empirical data to support the installation of said device?
May I answer that question?
Go ahead.
First of all, I would point out that through the GFCI program, it started in 1971. Many of those rental units should have had GFCIs, but did not install them for 2 reasons. One, the GFCI requirement kept changing from the 70s through the 80s, so it was difficult for even building departments to monitor what was going on. And then 2, when we do go into some rental apartment complexes, we know the age of the buildings, they should have GFCIs, and they don't. And they don't because they replace them with normal plugs, because something is going on. So that's the other side of this.
Okay.
So I want to
see
be
your point.
fair.
No, I see your point. But still, you can't get around, and yes, it's a number, 0. This does not prevent those kind of things. This prevents electrocution, if I understood what this code said.
Mr. Bulkey.
So my answer would be that I'm disturbed that people would knowingly break the law by not replacing GFI plugs with GFI plugs. I would also have the expectation that we enforce it at least in bathrooms and anywhere in sinks, so bathrooms and kitchens. So mine would be a more subtle nuance on, because I looked at this list, I'm like, my God, you know, they've almost got it to the point where unless it's in the middle of the living room, 15 feet away from something, you're gonna have to have a GFI plug. I didn't realize the extent to the law, but I think when you see 1971, which was 49 years ago, required for outdoor receptacles, I would assume that every outdoor receptacle will have a GFI plug on it. I would say 1975, 45 years ago, required for bathroom receptacles, that they would be in a bathroom. I don't know about garage, but definitely in the kitchen sink. I mean, I think that that's just standard operating practice. I'm not gonna wait for people to die, and then that would that, and I guess in Councilmember Simpson's mind, my question would be, if someone died of that, would you immediately agree that the law should be enforced? Well, and I think well-meaning people have come up with these rules because they believe that this is a life safety issue, unless we assume that they made them up just because they wanted to sell new plugs.
Yeah. Going forward, I can see your point. But when you take an existing structure and then you impose on that owner something that still works and has not led to a death, then why burden them with that cost? You could make the same arguments as the mayor was making. Then why are we going to wait for the next earthquake before we say houses have to be built by 2x6s rather than 2x4s? Your argument is valid only to a point, and I think it's not that I'm waiting for somebody to be electrocuted to say we need to change this, but rather it's you have people who have investments here, and we're asking them to change those investments when there is simply no empirical data at this point to suggest they have to.
I think the regulations are put together by well-meaning people who understand safety. Staff has come up with this, that it is a life safety issue. I think we can work with that rather than just walk away from this, because then we're in this case where these guys should have had the plugs. They didn't. So what do? Let them pass because, oh, they don't have the plugs now, and now we're blanket, no GFI. I would also argue it's up to this council. It's a cost of doing business, right? I mean, and so are we gonna determine, and I guess that's where maybe we should have that discussion. Is that a cost of doing business in the city of Lakewood that we're willing to ask the landlords to accept or not? So, and I haven't been given any information by anybody purporting to destroy this regulation or to remove this regulation from the books, how much money it's actually saved. Do we, I mean, putting in a few plugs, or is it, at what point is it an undue burden?
It's over $500 a unit. Mr. Bureau had the number in the.
Yeah,
Mr. Branstetter.
You know, I'm sort of here is that the entire checklist is based on code. And, you know, we have building codes that we have approved as a council. You know, we go through that every 2 years. There's a code update that gets approved. And we have expectation that people who are building things or remodeling things will do so, will follow the codes, and we inspect to be able to go and do that. That in this particular case, and going back, and I'll use the 1975 date, it is not onerous to tell someone, because your building doesn't make the code that was in effect when it was built, you know, you should bring it up to code. Okay, you know, now if it was built in 1960, you know, and it didn't have these, well, there is not anything in current building codes that would require you to do that until such time as you have to do some major repairs. But, you know, I think that we're not asking anyone to do anything to their property that shouldn't already have been done by code. And the fact that somebody, probably a previous owner and maybe not the current owner, got away pre-cityhood with some building something not to the standard, because the codes are generally established pretty much at the state level. In our codes, we have very few things in our code that we've adopted locally or made changes locally to what the state is. And so, you know, I'm kind of, you know, I would put an asterisk on the checklist that says if a building was built before 1975, that particular item doesn't necessarily have to be complied with. But if it's post-1975, when it should have been there all along, don't see any reason now while we're looking out for that. And I guess I don't want to wait for the first in Lakewood electrocution. I mean, the code exists because there are electrocutions all over the country that happened, and this was the fix that smart people came up with.
There may have been some because stupid people were drying their hair in the bathtub. You know, I actually agree with Mr. Branstetter, and as I mentioned, I was kind of hanging my hat on existing materials complying at the time can be replaced. But if they weren't compliant at the time, they weren't compliant at the time. And
here's another option to throw at the council. And this is something that we did talk about, and that is where no improvements are proposed as a part of a rental housing program, a property owner is not required to install GFCIs provided an evaluation is performed by an electrical contractor. They would have to hire an electrician to come out and take a look, but that could be cheaper than putting in the GFCIs.
And what would be the outcome of that inspection that you're looking for? For them to bless it?
Yes.
Based on the 1969 code?
Based upon the code that was in place at the time of installation.
complied at the time.
Yeah.
But it's $500 a unit.
Yeah, you can't.
License, yeah, complying with the code at the time of the they were built, is that what you're suggesting?
The other thing, if I could point out really quick, the other time that potentially you, well, not potentially, that you do have to bring your electrical up to code is if one changes out an electrical panel. So you're changing out panels and circuits, you have to install arc faults now, you have to install battery smoke detectors have to be charged with power, and you have to put in GFCI. So I mean, there could be times where you've got a building built in 1962 and they've changed out all their panels and they don't have GFCIs, and it's like, well, clearly you didn't get your building inspected. So there may be some instances even in that case where upgrades were required.
So let me work on my electronics education. So so what happens when you go and you see a box and it's the old screw in, and then, yeah.
Fuses, yep.
What does that fail immediately under, or do we just say that's okay as long as it's operable and it's?
Yeah.
So then it wouldn't have the GFI if it was that old, right? And then, but you wouldn't be required to have the GFI now under what we're talking about.
Those breaker, they're fuse panels in essence. They're just little
Yeah,
screw-in fuse
yeah.
panels. Usually what happens, and I try and get my staff to do what I like to do when I go around, there's usually 2 or 4 of those in the panel. Unscrew them and find out if there's a penny behind them, because those were easy to put a
Right.
copper penny behind, and it just, now you go around your fuse. So that's what would make them fail. If they're still functional, yeah, there's no reason. So our code does allow, if you've got a panel that was installed to code and it's not changed, then it's fine.
So we'll let you keep the old panel.
The GFCI, you can still install a GFCI on those panels. You can install them on pretty much any panel. They can be grounded, they can be non-grounded.
But you have to run the ground outside. And
They can be non-grounded. GFCIs have come to a point where they work fantastically without a ground as well.
There's a different type.
They're just, you're basically monitoring the power coming in and then going out of the neutral, and you can still shut the thing off even without a ground, because it's just
because you
monitoring
don't
variations.
so it's made for those houses.
Yeah, so you're just measuring the voltage in, voltage out, versus when it hits the ground, that's gonna change and it just shuts it off.
Because in like newer homes, you'd have the ground that you would connect in with the
Correct.
hot and the.
Correct.
Okay, so in this case, so they designed something for houses that don't have these then,
Yeah, the new.
that don't
new-
have the ground.
New GFCIs have come a long way, which is why.
But they
Dave said over
cost a
the
lot
years-
more.
Pardon me?
The smart, what I would call the smart GFIs.
They're all about the same now. They're in the $20 to $30 range. I just put one in my
Okay.
bathroom last night.
The issue is.
You're not supposed to.
The issue,
My house, I can.
the issue is, I install them now and then too, and now I'm marking on the checklist, like, how many more do I need? So the cost is really the electrician.
Yes.
That's the big,
Yes.
the $300 or $400 an hour, or whatever they charge now, or, okay. 180.
Plus, yeah, plus
Okay.
trip, plus standby, plus minimum, yeah.
We all went in the wrong profession. Electrical work is the way to go.
Yeah.
I don't know if that penny works anymore, given that it doesn't have any copper content.
That's true. You have to use one from
You have to-
1964.
Have to find it old. Anything further from Mr. Bureau? Enough abuse for one night?
Are we making a change or directing a change or not? I just want to be clear on that, because my only concern about it is all those poor blokes that have spent the money. I would hate to have them realize that, in April of 2020, they wouldn't have had to. I throw it out there, but.
I really think the number of inspections that were done like that way, that were pre-1975 structures, is probably very small.
So what are we saying? We want to leave this, we want to just ignore the complaints?
That's what I'm asking. What do we do?
Because, it's interesting, Paul made a good argument, which is an argument that I had prepared. Exactly what you said. My first response was, well, of course they're going to put these in. It's common sense. Until I started to think about the number of rental properties in Lakewood. Are we going to require people who own their homes that were built before a certain time to do this? You just put your finger on it. It's my property. I don't have to. So it seems to me if we're going to. True, and I agree, Jason. I thought that too. These are businesses. They should comply by certain regulations just like any other business in Lakewood. But I come back to, and the reason I asked the question about the electrocution, and I got it from this, our presentation, was you had pictures of open wiring by a regular old socket, like that one over there on the wall. And you still gave me the same number, 0. So again, I go back to that. If you have open electrical wiring that you showed me in the presentation, well, I guess a GFI or C wouldn't have helped there at all, would it, Paul? Because that person is dead no matter what, and yet we don't have people with smoking hair and coming out of their ears, do we? And so I'm a little conflicted on this because I'm saying it's not that I want somebody to die and then we jump into action. That's not my point. My point is that we worked hard to get this code in place. That was not an easy push. And the property owners, the landlord owners have been, and you said it tonight, they've been pretty decent to work with. And if I recall correctly, Dave, something we didn't expect. I believe you said, I wasn't so sure in the beginning if I wanted to advertise this program because you were suspecting there would be blowback. There hasn't been that blowback. So why are we now turning around and saying, oh, and by the way, if you don't have these in your properties, we're gonna make you pay for it. And that's, I would say, anything new, if you do any changes, absolutely, put them in. But if it's existing as is now and they don't have them, I'd leave them alone.
Mr. Bulk.
So a couple more questions on page, wherever you have the common inspection items failed and the number is 300, and this is from what year, 2018 or 2019?
2019.
Okay, so it's 300, almost 300 GFCIs / receptacles. So of that, what's the pure, what would be your guess? And you mentioned that there was some, well, that's all receptacles. That includes the broken ones that we saw that I think we have some agreement we need to change. But GFCIs would make up how many of those?
My guess is it's probably a 75-25 split, something along those lines. Mostly with GFCIs being the 75 and other electrical outlets being the 25.
Okay, and so then we're, we're talking about a substantial number, 200 plus or so. Let's say 225. And then of that, what's kind of the split, and these aren't all fair questions, but do your best. The split between the pre-75 and the post-75 or post-71, where they should have them.
Most of the inspections we've been doing have been older complexes.
Okay.
I would say, again, you may be 75-25, so most of the complexes that we've been inspecting would be pre-71, I would say.
Okay.
Maybe 70-30, something like that.
So they weren't even required to have them in bathrooms?
No, not at that point in time. If they're built in the 60s, no.
Okay, so I mean, this is kind of where I get hung up, because I think, as I mentioned earlier, I think that there's, around sinks and outside are the two where they clearly have needed them for a long, long time. And I think they're like smoke detectors where you should have them. Now, whether we're gonna ding them because they don't have it in the crawl space or some of these other things, I don't know, I'm not. But I just think that, and this is, the problem is that's hard for us, and that's what I think staff has to figure out. Like, what things are truly life safety issues, what are nice to haves. And I think that there is life safety issues, and there are probably some nice to haves, right? So, because smoke detectors, there's no, well, I didn't have smoke detectors when I built the house in 1950. I certainly am not gonna do them now. we don't allow that, and we don't seem to have an argument over that. And there are other issues that, growing up, I mean, we were in a house without the grounds, and none of us died. So I think there's more nuances there. That's why rather than, I mean, my thing would be rather than the council this blanket, let's get out of the GFI business, I think we should leave it to staff to kind of figure out a more subtle nuances, because I'm with Councilmember Whalen. If we just all of a sudden, hey, 1st of April, we're done, you don't have to worry about GFIs. That to me, if I was watching that, I was like, well, that's interesting. How did you make a 180-degree turn on an issue like that? I mean, and I would be very careful about making 180-degree turns. I mean, what does it take? I guess my question would be, if I owned a property, what does it take for me to get you to do a 180-degree turn on some of these other items? So I think we need to be very careful about just, okay, we've had some people complain, they don't want to do this. But I also see that you don't want to be overbearing, and I do worry about the undue burden part, but I can't define to you what an undue burden is. I wish I could.
Well, I'd like to see a draft amendment to the rental housing safety program for consideration by the council that essentially says what I thought 3023 said about existing materials to begin with. And that is that if there's a failed item where the owner can prove to the satisfaction of staff that it complied with the code at the time building was built, you don't have to upgrade to other materials. I think that's could be broader than just GFCIs. It's just recognizing 3023 and giving the owner an ability to say, okay, this building complied with code at the time, and it's still in its original safe condition. It's like driving a 57 Chevy without airbags. Well, we can discuss it.
Unintended consequences to that note?
Well, that's what the building code says now. It's just putting a procedure in for the owner to say, my building complies with the building code. We could also change the building code. But normally the trigger for building code upgrade is a substantial addition, some type of remodel, rewiring, replumbing.
It's like smoke detectors, fire detectors.
Smoke detectors
How
have
do you-
been state statute forever. I mean, I was been a landlord for 45 years.
But they weren't around in the 60s.
They upgraded the state statute to say on and after a certain date, if you're gonna rent this to the public, you gotta do it. Or if you sell it, you gotta have it.
I remember, at least in the 80s, you had, standard rental forms started having a provision where they signed off that they were working.
By the
smoke detectors.
80s, they were in there.
I believe it was actually earlier than that, slightly earlier than that.
Okay, so that was a state law, so that takes.
State law on any rentals, yeah. And then now it evolved into sales, and evolved into CO2 detectors, and then it evolved into hardwired on new residences. So you keep getting upgrades.
Okay.
Mr. Branstetter.
Yeah, I would be willing to consider an amendment to the ordinance along the lines that the mayor said. I would, though, want to, when we were looking at it, to also get an understanding of not just what was the code when the building was built, but some idea, and particularly with this particular issue, and if there was another area that the staff was, about what could have happened or been done to the building in the interim that would have triggered a change from the original building code? Such as you mentioned that you installed a new electrical panel or something, something like that, so that it's just not so narrowly as when was the building built, but also given the history of what's been done to the building since then.
That makes sense. Mr. Buer.
Myself and Mr. Gum have been noodling on your comments, and I think that we can kind of come back and address some of your issues. I would like to bring it back as a draft to make sure you're comfortable with it. There's a couple of ideas that we have that have not been discussed, and we'd like to consider that amongst ourselves before we bring it back to make sure that it's acceptable approach.
And I also appreciate in your narrative that although, 6 of one, half dozen of the other, that 2 or 3 of the cities that have the code don't. I mean, they exempt it, like the mayor is asking for, and a couple of them include it, Tukwila and Pasco. I would be interested to know how each side came to their thought process on that, because I think we're a lot more like Tukwila, our housing stock. It's probably the same age than a Seattle or we have some similarities to Bellingham, but they even have older stuff in a lot of cases. But I would be interested to know what their thought processes were. Did they just come to the same conclusion we did, and just in different ways?
Thank you.
Thank you. And now we move to a review of the JBLM North Access Improvement Project. Mr. Busich. Mr. Potswinski, there you are. I don't know over there. Did we cast of thousands here?
They're part of the consulting team?
Yes, they are part of the consulting team.
I didn't know if they had GFIs they wanted to replace.
We can check with them. They
They're not
may or may not want to replace them
The fire department
immediately.
left because the next idea was
They're
fire
not-
department should get a grant to go and replace it.
There's no electrical engineers, right?
Yeah, hopefully not. Good evening, Mr. Mayor, members of the council. Tonight, the Public Works Engineering Department comes before you to give you a status update on the JBLM North Access Improvement Project. As you've seen before, this project improves Northgate Road, Edgewood, Washington Boulevard, Gravelly Lake Drive between Washington and Nyanza, and also Vernon between Veterans and Washington Boulevard. Kind of got a little box there completed. When Veterans gets completed, the entire area kind of gets done up there. This project is scheduled to go out for, we're going to apply for grants on June or July of this year. With that in mind, we're trying to rush through preliminary design as best we can. It needs to be shovel-ready prior to the grant. That's one of the conditions of the grant we've heard from the OEA. So what have we done since we last came here and met with you guys to get authorization for the design? We have started working with Lakewood Water. The Water District came to us and has expressed interest in replacing the water mains along Washington Boulevard and Gravelly Lake Drive. In addition, they'll do a little section of Vernon to complete that. This has multiple benefits for both the city and the district. For the city, we realize lower prices because of the additional work. We also realize that we're not dealing with water mains that have been built in the 40s and they don't really know where they are during construction. So we're not tripping over them with delays and that sort of thing. For the district, they realize the same economy of scale, and they don't have to repair or replace the roadway over the top after we've just recently left. for the taxpayer, and the ratepayer, it's a real benefit for the fact that it saves both entities money and they don't have to deal with construction twice for the same thing. So they are going, the interlocal agreement's getting looked at. We anticipate it's going to come before you guys in the coming months to look at it. The cost for the main will be probably between $2 and $3 million, so it'll add to this project, but that is completely funded by the district, though it will be portion of the construction of this project. We've met with PSE. 4 transmission poles need to be relocated, in addition to some distribution poles that we need to also look at. The gas has not fully commented on whether they need to replace the mains. Offline, they've said no, they're pretty new, but we're not certain yet. They're still waiting to get back with us. It's a 3.5 or 3.5 mile project, so they're looking at everything, wanting to be sure. Pierce County Sewer does not have any.
Before we leave water, where does the where would the new main terminate? And how large is it?
It's a replacement of the existing mains. They do plan on upsizing because the existing mains, for instance, on Gravelly Lake Drive, they've got 3 existing water mains of various sizes between 6 and 8 inch. They just want one main that's 10 inch or 12 inches, excuse me.
What about going down Washington? Where does that go?
Going down Washington, they're going to do another 12-inch main. I think they have an 8 existing there. And it's kind of a mishmash of what they've got everywhere else.
And how far down would that go?
It would go from Edgewood
how far
to
west?
What's that?
How far west?
Edgewood. Yes, Edgewood. Correct. So it'd be the entire length of our improvements. They want to get out of the roundabout at Edgewood so that they're not impacted. Anything they have moving further to the west.
I'm kind of thinking out loud about how close that gets to JBLM and its housing, so we might be able to offer utility redundancy as part of our package. What? Oh, no, they want duplicity in all their utilities.
That would be something we could talk to them about, for sure. So we have also talked with Pierce County Sewer about replacing, or if they need to replace, they don't have any plans to replace any of their lines. They're relatively new. They don't have any manholes that they need to rehabilitate. However, our design may require us to spin a couple of the manholes and do some minor modifications. Not a big deal that way. We've engaged with West Pierce Fire to talk about not only the access to their station, but also how they're going to navigate the roundabouts, the sizes of their trucks, et cetera. Clover Park School District, the size of their buses, as well as the constructability of what they've got going on. We will hit Pierce Transit and the United States Postal Service as soon as we lock in the 30% design and we know what space we have to work with for bus pads or cluster mailboxes or what have you. The design team has completed the survey on Gravelly Lake Drive here last week, and the other design team for parametrics you have before you today is rapidly working on 30% design to get that ready. We need to have that locked in by the end of the week so that we can meet our schedule for the 60 and 90%. They're really working hard, long hours and everything else to get this done. A geotechnical study has been completed so that we can have our infiltration rates for stormwater and our pavement thicknesses, and a hazardous materials survey has been completed. Thankfully, we don't appear to have any dirty dirt or underground storage tanks that cause us problems during construction. So that's good news. The traffic counts have been done last month, and you'll see a video here shortly kind of detailing and walking through the roundabouts and how they're going to function in 2040 with assumed 1% annual growth. So it's kind of a, an optimistic growth. So what you'll see is what we anticipate it looking like in a worst case scenario in 2040. So it should be okay, modeled as it is. We've also begun right-of-way procurement. There are 5 parcels, 5 corner takes we need, varying from 65 square feet to a little over 1,300 square feet. At Interlochen is the one that's particularly large. But it's still a corner take, not impacting any existing structures or really what we anticipate being future development of the lots. It is correct. So we've got 5 takes total to do. We've also begun our public outreach by sending out 4,400 mailings, inviting people to 2 public open houses that took place the last 2 Thursdays in this room. We did receive 70 citizens at the first one and 30 at the second one. We asked people to jot down comments, and we do have the comments to pass along to you guys here after we're done. Copies of everybody's comments. They ranged from very receptive to the project to, very adverse to it. No, the roundabouts aren't going to work, or I can't get out of my driveway. Construction's going to be a nightmare, that kind of thing, the thing we typically would expect. Going through the timing of the project, we're looking like we need to, as I said before, we need to hit the 30% design by the end of the week in order to hit our 60% mid-April and get construction ready at the end of June for the grant submittal, which we still are on time for that, but we have very little float. I do want to emphasize that. We do meet weekly with the consultant teams, and I'm in contact with them daily, so we're ironing out things as we go, which is why we're here before you today to ask if there are any comments or questions you guys have so we can incorporate those in the design as we move along. So at this time, I want to run through the model, but maybe we can kind of kill 2 birds with 1 stone. We also want to have you guys back kind of as you do at the table, just to see if you guys have any comments. And we can answer questions back there as well as come back in here if you need. Yep, absolutely. Look at the video first, and it's going to drop down here in just a second into the Gravelly-Nyanza intersection first, and then move kind of northwest along the corridor. Yeah, what's that? Yes, it is up on the website. Yes, the sign will be relocated into the middle of the roundabout at Gravelly-Nyanza. As part of the traffic study, we do realize that Nyanza backs up in the AM and the PM peaks on Fridays. We've already analyzed this and are starting to talk to WashDOT about minor operational enhancements at the ramp terminal intersection that are low cost, potentially just restriping in the first phase and adding a second lane at the ramp terminal intersections to alleviate that. Yes. So, you guys are the traffic engineers. Think you can get more people through at peak times using the roundabouts and the lines? We do, specifically because of how roundabouts function. They're more efficient. If you look at it at a signal, the maximum you can really have in that intersection at one given time, unless it's straight through traffic, is 1 or 2 cars. The roundabout will offer more capacity, as well as the dead time for when you have yellow or red or the light's not timed 100% correctly never seems to be there. If you ever go to one of our signals, you'll notice, or any signal, you'll notice a lot of dead time in the intersection. You don't have that with roundabouts. They just operate a little more fluidly.
Okay, so this particular roundabout isn't 2 lanes wide, it's only 1 lane wide.
No, the model shows that we only ended up needing 1 lane wide at that without bypass lanes. So
Are you able to back up to the interlock?
he's, the Councilmember Brandstetter wants to back up to Interlochen. I don't know if you can back that up about 30 seconds.
I kind of want to be able to see the gravelly Washington and the Washington Interlochen like in the same frame.
That one right there. Oh.
Yeah, that's good.
Yep, because it'll spin you right around and look at it here in that same frame.
So you can see, and there's Gravely on the right and Interlochen on the left.
The grade, they coming up the hill from Interlochen.
Coming up
onto
Interlochen,
Washington.
we're still working on that.
Yeah. I drive that every day, so I'm very, very.
Part of it
That's
will be
awkward.
addressed through a little bit of a cut, and part of it won't be. So we're still identifying what we're doing with that.
So what's the take in that spot there? Interlochen is on the right, left-hand side?
If you're coming up to take a left from Interlochen onto Washington, the left-hand side is about a 1,300 square foot take. I think we were literally revising that this afternoon. And the right-hand side was at 600. It might be a little more now. The apartment, commercial, vacant property. Yes.
Okay, so I'm going down to Vernon right there in that.
Correct. That's Edgewood, actually. That's Edgewood. And that's Edgewood Northgate. There will also be a Welcome to Lakewood sign, probably not in the middle of that intersection, more towards we have a vacant spot right as you enter the city, vacant right-of-way spot.
This reflects peak traffic flow?
That reflects PM peak traffic flow as it was done a month ago, counted a month ago. The roundabouts really just move things through a lot more efficiently. What it doesn't show and what we've seen is backups sometimes from Northgate coming back into the city, and we'll need to look into that.
But you might avoid some of that with having both Veterans and Washington, right? So you're going to get it deeper with separated out instead of the cut-through stuff.
I'm not certain how many people are using Veterans. Does Veterans even tie back into, I don't know, I don't go that way, north.
From Northgate, you can cut in.
Oh, can you? Okay.
And people sometimes, they go straight through at Edgewood, and they go down to Vernon and turn right to go down into Lake City.
Just kind of an asterisk.
Come out of Northgate, when they come to Edgewood, instead of going left, some people go straight, and then when they get to Vernon, they make a right and they go down to Lake City and on to Veterans.
Go down Veterans. You mentioned Pierce Transit and pads earlier and getting to them in a next phase. That maybe is easy to address as a phone call. Pierce Transit hates pullouts. So their answer may be, we don't want them. And then you have, so different decision point.
For Washington in particular, the width is enough from curb to curb that they can pull off to the side and people can still get around them. We did that specifically for garbage trucks, for mail deliveries, and for buses, and especially for the emergency vehicle access. The width of curb to curb is 19 feet, so really what we analyze it as is an 8-foot parallel parking stall and an 11-foot travel lane to make sure that people can get past. But yeah, that's something we will talk with them about whether they want to have a shelter. Sometimes they say, no, we don't want a shelter out there, or the volume of traffic of bus riders not enough. Yes.
Yes.
That's Veterans.
Looks like it's flowing pretty well.
And this is rush hour?
This is PM peak. And remember that roundabouts don't operate the same as signals. So when you have a signal, it's a continuous buildup during the red cycle. So you'll see a lot more. I didn't believe it either. I had to count the cars and then look at the counts. because I kind of thought, wow, that's a little different. But we definitely are interested in, you know, videotaping this after the corridor is done, because while we have installed 2 roundabouts, and I'm not even certain that this might be the 3rd one since cityhood, one at Boundary and Portland and one at Murray and 150th, we don't have anything that's a real corridor to show relief.
Is there much national data on the incident rate of people doing knucklehead things and impacting at the point of intersection on those roundabouts where you got somebody in the roundabout, somebody turning in? Do we have a lot of national data on that kind of accident?
There's a lot of data on the safety and the reduction of roundabouts and accident rates. I believe I put something in the memo. It's not right in front of me.
That's one of the things they're throwing out at you in the comments, right?
And if we get some behavioral health money, educate people.
That's the big thing. Nationally, roundabouts reduce 37% of the overall vehicle collisions and 75% of the injury collisions and 90% of the fatal collisions at intersections.
I seem to recall when we first saw this down here on the table, I asked that question, and it looks to me like all of your roundabouts, even the big ones, are single lane.
Yes.
You've got the one break, so I had the same concern. In fact, I remember somebody telling me to take my stick and rock and go home. Remember that? And because I think the initial was there would be 2 lanes. And there was the question raised then, well, doesn't that create, because I've seen that where somebody will try to change lanes in the roundabout. You answered that question when I saw the single lane, and then when you take that right, it's still a single, and then it breaks off to the right. That, to me, mitigated any safety concerns I had.
They are all single lane with no bypass. Nyanza's got a bypass, sorry, excuse me. It's the first one, but it's not, the bypass isn't really shown. Well, I guess it might be shown here, is it? Yeah.
We'll run it again, take a picture.
Yep.
So with the 30% design, does that mean that Interlochen, a roundabout at Interlochen is in, or at what point might it be out?
We really want to stress that a roundabout at Interlochen is the safest and most effective way of moving traffic through the corridor. At this point, we would recommend it be in, but again, we listen to everything you guys say. Yep.
Yeah, as somebody who's nearly been T-boned there twice, I would feel just about anything's an improvement.
You're on Interlochen, it's the worst place to be.
This is the bypass, right?
Yeah, you don't have to.
That's actually safer than what it is now. You kind of got to watch for the guy yielding, or they just simply yield.
We will, we'll sign it and stripe it.
It's actually more intuitive than it is now, where the yield sign is counterintuitive. Well, when you come from the country club on Gravelly Lake Drive and you turn left to Nyanza, that's the yield. And because the other people are turning right, they have the free lane, and normally the people on your right will yield to you. So that signage is counterintuitive, and this corrects that.
Yes, it does.